Hello everyone, and a very good morning, afternoon and evening to all of you. I'm Neha Shamsheri, Events Coordinator for Strategic Imperatives Learning Events. Welcome to our accessibility session. Today's session is on making our videos accessible. So we'll get to know about the why of it and how we can do that. With that, let me now hand you over to Michael Gover from IBM Accessibility Research. Hi, Mike.
Thanks. Hi, Neha. Thanks a lot. So it's Mike Gower here, and I'm Juan Carlos, if you can just go to slide 2. What we're going to cover here is mainly, I had the subtitle of this for Simple Habits to Make Content More Versatile. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on primarily, but I'll do a bit of background on why be accessible and why talking about video now specifically, and then talk about some tactics for different kinds of videos, because the different kinds of videos all have different ways you can address accessibility for them. And then we'll talk about some considerations for captioning specifically, and then finally just focus on some player and playback considerations. So next slide. We're on slide 3 now. So why be accessible? Well, first of all, depending on where you live, there's a requirement for it. If you're in the U.S., Section 508 requires any U.S. federal government procurement to include following standards for accessibility. The Americans for Disabilities Act also has a requirement for public accommodation, which generally means if you've got a public website, it needs to be accessible. In Europe, there's the EN 301549, which in combination with the European Accessibility Act covers procurement in most EU countries on their own timelines. And a lot of other countries like Australia has their own standard, which is identical to 301549. However, I'm a pragmatist, and I know that a certain percentage of people will do stuff because they're supposed to, and then a lot of us need a bit more persuading and background than that. So I thought I'd give some more rationale on this slide. So on the second bullet, it's beneficial in a lot of ways. So the most obvious one is for users with disabilities. I'm talking about video here, but I really mean audio video, and I'm going to use that term synonymously. So if you've got audio and you can't hear, or you're hard of hearing, you can't hear half the material. And if you've got video and you're blind or low vision, you can't necessarily take the other half of the video. So you need to accommodate both those user groups. It's also very beneficial for non-native speakers, and that this is, again, a surprising thing. There's something called a curb cut effect, where basically you cut the edges of the curbs, and suddenly, yes, people with wheelchairs can get down them, but mothers pushing babies can get down them. You can do cool skateboard tricks off them, things like that. People begin using things in creative ways that weren't intended. So they began noticing that suddenly, when you began captioning, if you're a non-native speaker, it's a lot easier to follow what's going on, and the reverse is true. If you have an accent and you're being captioned, people who can't totally catch your accent can have a better understanding of what's going on. Accessible videos counter a lot of environmental factors which we all tend to run into, especially in a mobile world. We have poor audio connections because our network's running very slowly. We're trying to view something on a noisy environment like a subway or something like that, or we're in a quieter environment where we can't actually play the audio. So quite often an ability to have accessible videos will accommodate a lot of different situations. Findability is something that people don't often think about, but video content is effectively unsearchable. The only real cues there are right now is the title that you give to your video. All the content of it in it is not indexed in any meaningful way. Well, caption that information or add audio descriptions for the video content, and suddenly all the content of that video is fully searchable and indexable. So it becomes vastly more useful for everyone. And finally, 80% of caption users have typical hearing. So what's happening is people are using complementary ways to use things. If there's a transcript, I don't want to have to take 20 minutes to watch it. I might just scan through the transcript really fast. So it just gives us a lot of different ways of consuming information. Slide 4, please. Okay, so I mentioned it's being a requirement. So what are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines? And by the way, I will, out of force of habit, occasionally pronounce that as WCAG, which is a really confusing acronym. So when I say WCAG, I'm talking about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So there's three of them, basically. And one is that for pre-recorded audio only or video only, you need to have an equivalent alternative, which normally is going to be your transcript, just a text copy of what's being communicated. In the second instance, where you have pre-recorded audio-video content, where the audio and video are synchronized together, you need to have captions, and you need to have audio descriptions, and in some cases an alternative to an audio description. Now, most people are pretty familiar with what captions are, but not everyone's that familiar with what audio descriptions are. And I'll talk about that a bit more, but effectively, if you imagine captions are the replacement for the audio content, audio descriptions are the replacement for the video content. It's actually someone narrating what is important information happening on the screen in a video. And finally, in the third category, live audio only information needs captioning. And that is becoming a more substantial amount of information these days. I wanted to talk about a couple of concepts that are in the language in WCAG. One is this idea of synchronized. So audio-video content is designed to be played back, and so if you're trying to make an equivalent experience for everybody, the idea is you're going to try to bias towards that ability to play back synchronized, which is where captions come in. They're played in sync, and audio descriptions are also done in sync with the existing media. The other one that I occasionally get questions about is open versus closed captions versus subtitles. So open captions are always there. They're back in the days of subtitles movies, they're literally burned into the screen, so you can't turn them off. Closed captions, which probably most people are more used to, are the ones you can turn off and turn on the screen. Closed captions tend to be a bit more versatile because the user in a good player can manipulate the size of the text, where they are on the screen, etc. In terms of subtitles versus captions, they're effectively the same thing, except subtitles usually include a translation. So I'm watching a French film, I might watch it with English subtitles. The one thing that usually is included in closed caption, which won't be included in subtitles, is other verbal or audio content. So usually subtitles will only have the dialogue, but closed captions might communicate doors closing or applause, things like that. Now, WCAG has been around since 2008, and audio-video requirements were there at the first version almost 10 years before that, and yet here I am talking about it 10 years after WCAG came into place. So what's changed? If we go to slide 5, basically what's changed is a massive growth in video, and not only a growth in video, but a preference for it. Now, the statistics on this slide, I pulled them off of a fairly quick web search. I'm not sure if I would put a lot of money on them, but they're pretty persuasive as they are. So way more than 1 billion hours of video are being watched a day. That's 500 million just on YouTube, 500 million just on Facebook. So just compare that to 10 years ago. The majority of marketing pros think that video gives you your best return on investment. So there's actually a bias now going on to people who are trying to persuade you of things, that video is how they want to go. On the flip side of the coin, 59% of executives say that if they're offered the content in either text or video, they would prefer video. So then there's this bias again going towards the consumption of information. And I don't believe this bullet, but if it's true, it's amazing. Viewers retain 95% of a message when they watch in a video compared to 10% when reading. As someone with a writing degree, I find that kind of a horrifying statistic, and so I'm highly skeptical of it, but I thought I'd include it. So more content's growing, more preference, therefore people become more dependent on that as either the primary or only form of communication. So if it's not accessible, you're now excluding a substantial amount of your population. So there's what a tie-in goes between the requirements and it being beneficial to make them accessible. Slide 6, please. So I just wanted to touch on what the key caption challenges are, and then on the next slide what the key audio description challenges are. If you do not need captions, you don't quite often think of this, but you're essentially a recipient of communication. It's almost like back in the 20th century where you just had to kind of watch what was on TV. In Canada, I only had one channel I could watch in where I live, so I didn't really have any choice about what I wanted to watch. Same kind of things happening here. The producer or the uploader controls the captioning. And so if they don't do it, there's not a lot of recourse you have. For instance, on YouTube, yes, someone can actually caption someone else's videos, but only if the uploader gives them permission to do that. In a lot of environments, the player may not even support captions. Second, as a consumer, I may have no way to request captions where they're not there. There was a situation in IBM a while ago where multiple people were using one YouTube account. So I think a number, like around 10, 12 people, all were using a single YouTube account to load it to one channel. So of course no one had any idea who would upload any one video. So if you wanted to get a request on one of those, there was no way to do it. And even where there's a one-to-one ratio of uploader to content, there sometimes there's no obvious way of getting a hold of the publisher. And finally, if you find a situation where you can put in a request and someone's willing to change it, requests can take a long time. This statistic is from people who are creating captions, but they say 55% of them turn around in 2 to 4 days, 25% of them turn around in 5 or more days. So if you're trying to watch something and it has any topicality to it, you have some real challenges on your hand. The second main thing, besides just being the kind of unwilling recipient with no control, is that captions aren't that accurate. So again, this is a statistic from the people who are creating captions. They say 45% of the captions are generally high quality, but sometimes inaccurate. And that sometimes inaccurate is the key issue here. Studies have shown that when you get around a 3% error rate, comprehension drops off substantially. And the last time I checked, this number is changing all the time, but speech-to-text engines that do the auto-generations of captions are running somewhere around 95% right now. So right out of the box, if they're not corrected, the comprehension rate is going to be dropping substantially on any of those auto-generated captions. Next slide, please, slide 7. Okay, so that's captioning. Audio description challenges. Well, they have all the issues the captions had. Basically, there's no end-user control, plus all these other things. So first of all, people have no idea what audio descriptions are. The vocabulary isn't helped. You'll hear some people call them video descriptions. And there's also a service, a trademark service called Descriptive Video Services. That's an old running argument about whether you want to talk about the fact that you're describing the video or you're describing it by audio. So you know, they're two different terms that almost sound like different things. They're talking about the same thing. Besides the confusion on just awareness and education, much fewer players support them. It's actually quite hard to find a video player that will actually play back audio descriptions. There is no automated way of creating audio descriptions right now. I'm sure AI is going to catch up and do that job right now, but it's having a lot of problems just with static images as it stands. And finally, what you need to do to make audio descriptions accessible, to make the video accessible with audio descriptions really changes on the content type you have. And I'm going to talk about each of these three. There's talking head videos, there's instructional demonstration videos, and then there's the really slick advertising, commercial-grade videos that someone knows what they're doing created. And I'm going to talk about each of those in turn. But because people are less aware of why they need to think about audio descriptions, I thought I would do just a sample 1-minute video of what it's like experiencing a typical instructional demonstration if you can't see the screen very well. So Juan Carlos, if you could just roll that clip, please.
Thanks very much, Mike. Just before we get into the demo, I'll talk through a couple of slides. Here are just some of the clients we have. There are many other top tiers, but you can only fit so many logos on one page and make it legible. This slide shows our current rollout plans and upcoming features. The release for this year will incorporate some accessibility changes. Now I'll just switch over here. Okay, so this is what the current application looks like. You can click this here to see your status. You'll see that sometimes this kind of thing comes up. I don't think it's really a problem, but you can click the cancel message or even activate the checkbox if this makes sense to you. These are the main functions here. Most people usually choose this first function for common activities. As you can see, most activities you do in a normal day fall in here.
Okay, so for folks who can't see or see well, just to let you know, basically everybody else kind of experienced your reality. I just played a 1-minute video. I just made it up, but I effectively blurred the video, so you couldn't really see what happened. I actually make that video more accessible than it could be because I actually had captions on it so that deaf and hard of hearing users could also experience why you might need audio descriptions. And I don't know if it happened for other people, but the audio cut out a little bit for me, so I was actually only watching the captions to understand what I was supposed to be saying on the audio channel. So I hope that illustrates it, and a lot of things that I was doing wrong in that demonstration I'm going to talk about in some of these next things. So on slide 8, I just wanted to find out if there were kind of any questions on this landscape I've talked about, the reality of current requirements, what we're considering for video, and just throw that out. After we handle questions on that, the next thing up will be talking about strategies for common kinds of videos.
Right, so we do not have any questions, apart from the interest on that last research statistic that you had shared. That was to do with 95% retention of videos versus 10% when reading in text. So people were interested in knowing, do you have the source of that particular statistic with you?
Yeah, I've actually got the sources on the notes on the slides themselves. So if folks want to have a look at, now remember that these these references were all pulled from sites that promote captioning, or video. So I would take them with a grain of salt. Some of them are more solid than others. The statistic on comprehension dropping at 3% error rates is from a pretty reliable source. But some of those other ones, I went, I would be taking them with a bit of a grain of salt.
All right. So there's another question from Phil, and he says, does IBM Cloud Video Players handle descriptive video audio descriptions?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
All right. Okay, so we don't have any questions right now, Mike. We want to continue, and we can look at them a little later in the session.
Sure, that sounds great. Okay, so on slide 9 then. Okay, so I referred to those 3 kinds earlier: talking heads, instructional demonstration, and commercial videos. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the first 2 of those. So on slide 9, I'm going to be talking about easy ways to fix talking heads. Now, I'm not talking about the band. I'm talking about those kind of videos where you have head and shoulders shots of usually one, sometimes a couple of people gabbing back and forth about something. And the good news is that if you have good production values, it's really easy to address this kind of video after the fact. There's effectively 2 things. You generate and you correct your captions, and then for the audio description equivalent, you just make a static text alternative for the video information. That static text alternative would normally contain 4 things, or 3 things and maybe 1 more. The name and title of the speaker, any text that's happening on the video, if information appears on screen or something like that, or if there's banners in the background, kind of any kind of text that gives you some context. And the exception to that is captions. Because captions are already a replacement search for something, you don't have to replicate them again. And finally, I kind of mentioned this already, but if there's a kind of description of a setting, like Ginny Rometty's talking at the White House or in the Oval Office, so you can describe, the Oval Office. And you can also do this for multiple speakers as long as there's some context. And what I mean by that is if the speakers are introduced and their voices are distinguishable, it would probably be a bit more of a challenge to just have a static text. It was very difficult to discern two people's voices because you would never be quite certain who was talking. Once you do that, you kind of solve the talking head problem from an accessibility perspective. I'll go into a bit more about static text alternatives later on, but effectively there's no real meaningful information on the video, so you can cover it very quickly. And I'll also talk more about generating and correcting captions later too. On slide 10, the next 2 of these things, screen capture videos. The key here is you've got to do some planning. Now, by screen capture videos, what I'm talking about here are demonstrations that use screen capture. Usually there's narration. You could think of this as being an example right now, any kind of slide PowerPoint presentation I would categorize in this area. Really need to do two broad things. One is you want to create a good audio narrative during your recording. And the second one is you want to provide captions. Now I'm going to go back to the first point because it's pretty important. You need to have good quality audio. So the most important rule of that is you need a good headset. If you're relying on a microphone on your computer, you're going to begin picking up a whole bunch of more sound in the room. For instance, the room I'm in right now has a really loud fan in it, which I'm hoping isn't coming over on this audio. But because I have a headset, it's going to be much less likely to be coming through in any meaningful way that would affect the quality of the audio. You need to script your dialogue, or you need to be very good at speaking extemporaneously in an accessible way. And with some practice, you can do this. You kind of think about the things you need to do. For instance, as I go through a slide deck like this, I usually announce the slide number I'm on, and I usually announce the title of the screen. That's not just to help cue Juan Carlos that I want to go to the next slide, but it's also so that if anybody's following along because they can't do a video conference presentation, they're aware of where I am and what the context is I'm speaking about. One piece of advice that has been around a long time, in fact, it's been kind of a piece of advice for Dragon Naturally Speaking for almost every release of it, is pretend you're on the radio. And if you kind of think about the fact it's an audio-only communication, then if you're kind of like a radio announcer, you're going to immediately be more intelligible. And I'm going to go into that a bit more in detail. The final thing is that if you do this, if you just make sure that you're creating good audio narration during the recording, you don't actually have to provide audio descriptions. And that is because there's a note in each of the three WCAG 123, 125, and 127 requirements, and it says if all the information in the video track is already provided in the audio track, no audio description is necessary. So you basically fulfill the need by just creating a good quality content to begin with. And then the second thing after the audio narration is, with good audio narration, when you do your captions, that all gets turned into text. So it's, again, more easily identifiable, more indexable and everything. And if you're working from a script in that second bullet where I suggested speaking extemporaneously, or having a script, if you've generated a script, you can usually, for most tech platforms, use a script to generate the captions, and then you don't even have to basically do anything to them because they're already punctuated as you had it. Slide 11, please. Okay, so I mentioned that it's really important to have good quality audio. So I wanted to go over that a bit more on this and just have some other basic strategies for improving your sound quality. So besides using a headset, which I can't emphasize enough is a good quality headset, well positioned, the rule is usually you should be able to put your thumb, I'm going to do it after I say it, you usually put your thumb between the corner of your mouth and the microphone. You should be able to kind of contact both that way, like so. If you have any specialized vocabulary, you want to make sure you spell it out and you train either your captioner or your auto captioner in how it's done. You might have noticed I talked a bit about WCAG and what that meant. Another one that quite often gets caught in the accessibility world is ARIA, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Application, but inevitably produces ARIA because why would anybody be talking about ARIA in the middle of a sentence? You want to maintain an even volume. This is made much easier with a headset where if I turn my head around like this, my mouth is kept in position to the microphone. Another reason why you don't want to just use a set place microphone, because when you turn your head away, you're losing a lot of that content. The fourth one is always a humbling thing, but know your weaknesses. Are you, like me, a fast talker? Are you, like me, someone who tends to mumble a bit? Do you have an accent? Those are things you can compensate for if you plan it. I have Post-it notes put up around saying, slow down and smile, and things like that. You can arrange for a co-pilot when you're doing presentations or when you're creating production who can point out the things you're doing that are becoming more of a problem as you're going along. And you can seek feedback, multiple polls during a presentation if you're doing that kind of thing, pausing regularly for questions. You'll notice I actually build them right into my slide decks when I'm doing presentations. And I've in the course of this slide, I've stopped talking about videos and started talking about presentations. That's because some of these are about presentations, but presentations get recorded and then they're videos. And so lo and behold, they need all the same requirements. And a lot of the principles are the same. If you follow these basic strategies, you become more understandable for anybody who's actually participating in a presentation, and you improve the accessibility because the automated speech recognition happens with less work. You don't have to do as much to clean up mishears. By the way, I mentioned automatic speech recognition. I will usually talk on a presentation like this about auto-generated captions, but the term in the real world tends to be ASR, automated speech recognition. On slide 12, the other thing I mentioned about good habits was pretending you're on the radio, and I just wanted to explain this a bit more. So radio announcers work with limitations. They're very similar. Obviously, no listeners can actually see what they're seeing, so they have to describe what's going on. And they need to be really clear and understandable because people are relying on that. Very similar to any kind of video. Second thing is they have time limits. You know, most of the time, radio stations operate on a time basis. You only have 10 minutes to do this or half an hour for your program. So you need to provide enough information but not be verbose. And you need to speak at a pace that's neither too slow nor unintelligibly quick. And that was a demonstration. And so you need to just be kind of even Steven. So one way of thinking of this is pretending you're on the radio. The other one I tell people is assume someone cannot see the screen when you're doing a presentation. They're driving and listening, or they're blind. And either way, if you just assume one of your participants can't see the screen, you're going to create a more accessible video or conference if you're doing it. I'm sure most of us on this have experienced the remote conference experience where you're on a phone, everybody's around the room, and the audio is horrible, and you can't really tell what's going on, and there's a bunch of nonverbal communication. So again, you know, same thing there. For those of you on the phone, and you can then provide some description of what's happening in the room. I see heads nodding, I see puzzled looks, etc. Slide 13. So I want to talk about specific tactics for, you know, we've now gone over improving your sound quality, kind of the mindset you can get of thinking that you're on the radio. What are some specific things you can do to narrate audio descriptions on slide 13? And there's a few of these, and I'll talk a bit about this. I think we've got time. So I'm going to go through each of these point by point, and there's 6 of them. First one is you want to describe any pertinent and meaningful text on the screen. So this is especially important if you're doing a demonstration of an application or something like that, because again, it's self-evident to someone who can see well if you're sharing your screen, but it's obviously not self-evident if you can't see it. One of the things that tends to happen is people begin to pick up their mouse and refer to things by their pointer. So when you do that, you really want to avoid saying only this or here, or even better, this here, to describe UI components. So this kind of ties on the next bullet, but use nouns. So this button labeled, click me, enough information to provide clarity on what UI component you're talking about. And you can do that in the other way as well. If you want to provide better context, you not only can describe an element by its name, which is the best way, but you can also throw in some sensory perceptions as well. So you can say click the send button, but you can also say click the green send button in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. At one point in time, that would help people who had problems with orientation and stuff like that. But with mobile now, the way the screen readers work on mobile, they actually allow a user to move their hand around on the screen. So it's actually possible to get some level of gross navigation without sight on a mobile device. So it actually is useful to a lot of people to use that sensory perceptions on locations and things like that. Fourth item is to fully describe the sequence of actions, and this is especially important when you have dynamic content happening. So I'm working through a wizard, and things are happening on the screen. I want to acknowledge the appearance and disappearance of things as they're happening, so that there's an equivalent to what I'm seeing visually on the screen. Kind of tying in with that, as things appear and disappear, I want to give them names. So for when you have a new page open up or you have a dialogue appear, if they're accessible, they're supposed to have titles. So say the title, and you can describe what its feature is as it appears. And finally, when you're using a mouse, which most people tend to do when they're doing demonstrations, they're going to hover, or they're going to select something, or scroll on the page with it, or open something. Just say what you're doing. I'm going to take the mouse here and hover it over top of this word, and a tooltip appears that says this. Now, these are specific things to demonstration video, and you'll end up realizing that as you get into different environments and different kind of mediums, you'll have different kind of tactics. But these points here are really good for screen sharing or for demonstrations. Okay, and on slide 14, that was a fair chunk of information. So does anybody have any questions on what's been covered on just mechanics of good sound, or how to go through things on narration? And once we tackle this, we'll go to captions.
Yeah, Mike, we had a question that said, is there a program that we can use for IBM videos that already creates the text on recorded videos, speech to text?
Yeah, there is. IBM Cloud Video was a product called Ustream that was acquired by IBM, I think, a couple of years ago now, and it has the ability to auto-generate captions on the fly. It does not have an ability to do audio descriptions. Nothing has that right now. But if you're following that these basic things of having good audio sound and good narration, you can use that to cover that. And I'm going to go into some detail about that coming up when we talk about captions.
All right. So there was another question, which was if the content in a video is also available in a topic in Knowledge Center, do we still need to make the video accessible with captioning? Or can we link to the topic in Knowledge Center in lieu of captions?
Okay, so this is a question that comes up sometimes because generally the requirement in IBM has been that if you have multiple output formats, you only need to make one accessible. When that's said, it is typically talking about I'm outputting in a Word, or I'm outputting in a PDF. And when you get to having information by text or by video, there's a really important principle, and that is if there's no new information being conveyed in the video, then it is not necessary to do that because you're not adding additional information. But the second any more information is included in that video than there is in printed material, it must itself be accessible. Okay, and some people might even disagree with that interpretation, but that's the interpretation I've seen come through on a lot of things.
We have a question from Phil, and he's asking, are there any videos or references that demonstrate best practices in this area?
Yeah, just before I get to Phil's question, I also want to qualify that a bit. If that's a situation where there's no additional information, you need to actually be indicating that as part of it. Or you're going to run into problems because no one will know whether there's more additional information or not. So there needs to be some cue saying, this is also available as a video with no additional information, etc. I'm sorry, could you just repeat Phil's question, please?
So he wanted to know if there are any videos or references that demonstrate best practices.
Yeah, and I'm going to touch on a couple of those. So maybe if we can just defer that question, I actually talk about some resources later on.
All right. Okay, with regards to the IBM Cloud Video, there's a question. Is that accessible for free within IBM, or do we need to sign up for accounts?
I'm not sure if anybody from IBM Cloud Video is available, so I'll give you my understanding, and someone can correct it sometime. You can sign up for, anybody can sign up for a 90-day free usage. But I know that there, at least for me, I was able to get a streaming video count. It could be just because I was doing testing with it. I don't know, but I believe that there are probably different branches of IBM that have worked out deals with IBM Cloud Video. I think the best way to do that would be to send a query to your manager or maybe to Cloud Video about it. But for sure, you can go to video.ibm.com right now and sign up right now and get a 90-day free use of it.
Right. Okay, there's one last question from Sarah, and she wanted to know that if you're going to suggest in this session how to get funding for video captions for pre-recorded videos and for transcripts, and the right IBM teams or vendors to work with. These are the two separate questions.
Okay. I'm not the person to ask about funding. I do know that IBM has contracts with captioning services, and I'm not sure which silos of IBM that contract covers. I also believe there are negotiations going on for other services right now. So I'm probably not the best person to answer the first part of that question. And what was the second part of that, please, Neha?
The second part was, and the right IBM teams or vendors to work with.
Okay, yeah, and I provide a link later on. Caption First is the company that currently provides real-time captioning. So in other words, I believe they're captioning this video today, or this presentation today. So if you need something actually done in real time, they provide that. They also have a service for doing after-the-fact creation of captions from an audio or video source. And like I said, there's a link later on, so you can review the deck later on and get that from them.
Yeah, we'll be sharing this deck along with the replay mailer that we'll send out in a few days. So you should have all the information that's there in this deck. There's one last question from Francis. I seem to have missed this one. She wanted to know, did you, when captioning talking head videos, do you label utterances with the speaker's name?
You don't. Well, because when you're doing talking heads, what happens with the audio description part, and this is the replacement for the meaningful video content, there effectively isn't any. I mean, I'm just a talking head right now, so it could just say, Mike occasionally gesturing with his fingers. I'm joking about that, but I mean, it's just Mike Gower presenting. There's nothing meaningful about the background. I got a pretty ugly piece of stock art in this office, so there's nothing meaningful going on if it was just me talking. Obviously, it's a presentation here. There's more text than that, but I'm getting a little complicated here. Because it's a PowerPoint presentation, all the information is available afterwards, so it's not quite the same thing. So let's remove the presentation from it and just talk about a talking head. There's no ongoing video information. So when you're doing the audio descriptions, you just need that static information. In terms of the captioning of the audio in a talking head, the captions can have the person's name on it, but if it's just one person talking, it's kind of silly to use up that much space on it. If you had multiple people talking, or maybe I guess multiple people talking, you could have the person's cue. But again, it seems a little redundant to me when it's going to be synchronized with the person speaking in terms of their video. So I wouldn't see a need for that necessarily.
All right, great. Thanks, Mike. I think we can move on with the deck. We don't have any more questions as of now. Okay.
Great. So we had some questions about captioning. So the next part is going to talk mainly about captions. So this is a generic guidance on working with auto-generated captions on slide 15. But it's important to just follow this basic process. So typically, you're going to upload the video unless you're actually streaming it. And I don't really talk about streaming here because I don't do that myself, and the concepts should be essentially the same. So after you upload your video, you're going to generate the captions. Some services you can set so that as soon as you upload the video, it captions. If you can do that, I highly recommend you do that so you don't forget to begin generating them. And once they're generated, you need to correct them. And this is probably the most important of the 5 points here. People assume that if they got auto-generated captions, okay, I'm done, it's ready, and they never are. At the least, as it stands right now, there's no punctuation. So you're going to have to go in and put in the periods and then capitalize the first word of the next sentence after that. After I've gone through each of the basically chunks of caption, when I'm correcting them, I then make sure I preview the final results in real time. And it's surprising how often I capture something that I missed when I was doing it by line. I don't recommend spending a lot of time fiddling around with the timing of them. People who can hear make a lot of assumption that the caption has to be absolutely verbatim with what they're saying and timed exactly with it. That's handy, but if you can't actually hear the audio, it doesn't matter if the captions come up a tiny bit before or after what's going on screen. The more important thing is that they're actually on screen long enough to be able to be read. So really previewing it will give you some idea if the captions are coming up properly and are on screen long enough to read. And finally, you need to publish them. A lot of things will automatically publish the captions once you click a button, but there's usually an actual need to push something to actually say, yes, caption this. I'll also mention that, generally speaking, when you actually edit the captions, some platforms will now have 2 different versions of the captions there. They'll have the auto-generated one and the edited one, and you need to decide whether or not you want to delete the old ones or leave them in place for some reason. So deleting the original captions is also something you might need to do. Now, I'm not going to go into that in detail for either platform. We have guidance on both IBM Cloud Video and YouTube, and there's a link on slide 15. I also have a link to that on the last slide of the deck. So I'm not going to spend time doing that. They're extremely clear instructions, and if there's any issues with them, be sure to let us know. But I think they're very, very precise. So on slide 16, you've just done your auto-generated captions. What are some known issues with them? First of all, automatic speech recognition, ASR, is rapidly improving. I mean, it's amazing how quickly it's happening. But there's a really big but about that, and actually there's a few different buts about that. The first one is, right now, there's no punctuation with the services I've seen. So you're going to have to go in and punctuate that. Second one, errors are not queued. And what I mean by that is that speech recognition wants to make real words, and so it's going to make a real word. So if you're just looking for something misspelled, it's never going to be there. So to figure out what's wrong, you've actually got to read the text and figure out what word doesn't make sense in the context. And if you're listening as you're doing it, quite often you bias yourself to think the word is actually correct. The third one, and I mentioned this earlier, specialized vocabulary is going to be invariably incorrect. If the word is, we're all professionals, so we usually have a lot of nomenclature in our talk, a lot of acronyms and stuff. Those things are not going to get caught by auto-generated captions. And if you use it again and again, it's going to be wrong, and it might not be consistently wrong. They might be do different ways of making the words wrong. And I'm going to demonstrate that a bit later on if I got time. I mentioned the timing and display of captions is variable. I don't recommend people spend too much time going back and worrying about the time and display because it can take a lot of time. But not to pick on IBM Cloud Video right now, but one of the latest iterations I've seen, they're only doing 1 line of captions. And when you have 2 lines, you have a bit more ability to scan quickly, and so it's really important that the captions not only be there, but be there for duration that is usable to them. And so I've seen different solutions now which are really, I think, on the verge of failing timing display requirements to be accessible. 2 more points for known problems. One is that too many videos are never reviewed. I don't know what the statistics are, and it'd be an interesting study, but I saw one video on making captions, which had itself, it was captioned, but it obviously hadn't been reviewed. You know, it was just wrong, and it's pretty distracting for anybody when you're watching something with captions on. The captions are wrong. Final point. Low literacy is more common in deaf and hard of hearing users. I'm not going to go into the details for that, but if you imagine if you have you know, high literacy and you're having problems kind of figuring out what the captions are and figuring out what the wrong words are, if you have challenges reading at a normal rate, imagine how much more cognitive load you have trying to do that. Okay, so that's 6 things to really bear in mind when you just run auto-generated captions without reviewing them again. On slide 17, some good news about this. There's lots of really interesting innovations being worked on around captioning, and IBM Research is doing some of these things. Experimenting with variable line length. In other words, in prose, we get trained that we're just going to be reading across, and line breaks are completely arbitrary. You know, the page, the text on the screen just gets severed and start on the next line to fit on the page. But if you think about poetry, line breaks in poetry are highly meaningful. And so doing some studies about whether or not if there's just slight pauses in how someone's speaking, if you bias line breaks to that, does it help with readability? Similarly, if you can generate punctuation based on pauses in speech, can the punctuation help people understand that there's a break in the audio there? Feedback on low confidence words. When ASR happens, the machine is aware of the level degree it thinks there's a match, and so if we can begin providing that information to the users, it can really help for someone reviewing the captioning. Oh, there's a word here that's flagged that it doesn't think is good. I should make sure this is correct. And for the end user, if something kind of doesn't make a lot of sense, they can a bit more easily blurb over it if you know it's a lower confidence word. And finally, there's a lot better players on the market now, and they're getting better. So they have user preferences more frequently. So you can change the font, you can change the location, you can change the background of the captions to improve the readability. And there are improvements on players for audio descriptions, although they're coming along more slowly. Now, what I want to do here is demonstrate one of these innovations to you. I've got 2 versions of the same video. I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'm only going to play about 40 seconds of it, but I just wanted to let folks understand how changes in caption presentation can improve understandability. So I'm going to be sharing these videos with you. You're not going to get any audio, and that's kind of intentional in situation. It's kind of determined by the technology we're using. But in this situation, I want people to pay attention to the captions and how they differ between these videos. The videos are identical in terms of the words. The presentation is the only thing that changes. So I'm just going to share Google Chrome, and I'm going to make this big. Okay, so here's the first of these.
Would it be possible to predict the next disease epidemic? IBM and the Carey Institute are trying to do just that. For the Cognitive Disease Hunter project, we are focusing on diseases that can spread from animals to humans, or what scientists call zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases include bird flu, Ebola, influenza, Lyme disease, the Zika virus, rabies, swine flu, and West Nile fever. Typically, reactions to zoonotic diseases have been reactive. Once an outbreak occurs, actions are taken to control it. What if, instead of reacting to the next zoonotic disease outbreak?
Okay, so I'm going to pause that there. For folks who can't see, there are links, so I'm hoping you're following along your own deck and going out to hear the audio of that. This is basically a presentation on zoonotic disease, which is, a dedicated word. Actually, YouTube did a pretty good job of capturing it most of the time. I'm now going to share the second of these videos where we made some changes to how the videos are operating. And again, I apologize if you're low vision or can't see, because I can't really demonstrate caption presentation in any way that's not visual. Okay, second video.
Would it be possible to predict the next disease epidemic? IBM and the Carey Institute are trying to do just that. For the Cognitive Disease Hunter Project, we are focusing on diseases that can spread from animals to humans, or what scientists call zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases include bird flu, Ebola, influenza, Lyme disease, the Zika virus, rabies, swine flu, and West Nile fever. Typically, reactions to zoonotic diseases have been reactive. Once an outbreak occurs, actions are taken to control it. What if, instead of reacting to the next zoonotic disease outbreak?
Okay, and I'll stop sharing my screen now, Juan Carlos. So what happened there was that we ran the audio of those videos and detected pauses in speech, and then had some metrics and thresholds on when the pauses reached a certain amount, we were going to start biasing the line breaks to occur there. When they got a bit longer, we were going to put a comma in, and when they got longer than that, we put in an ellipse. And the beauty of that is that none of those things are actually indicating a kind of a linguistic meaning. An ellipse can mean a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily have to mean end of a sentence. And so we did some testing with this and found that users, especially deaf and hard of hearing users, found that really helpful. And so that's the kind of thing that we're testing right now to see what we can do without doing a massive amount of artificial intelligence to immediately improve the consumption of captions. Okay, I also wanted to talk about another thing I mentioned, which was indicating errors. So on slide 18, I've got something that IBM Cloud Video is doing, which is feedback on confidence. And I've got a screenshot here, and it's showing the actual caption editor inside Cloud Video. And so this is, again, looking at the existing video we just looked at, and on half the screen, we've got the video playing, and on this other half, we've actually got the text that's going to show up as the captions. And underneath certain words, there's yellow underlining, and they're the low confidence words that IBM Cloud Video had when it was happening. So as an example, it underlines excuse, and it's not precise in where it's got it. I tend to think of these things as kind of identifying there's a problem somewhere around here. So the text reads, "So not excuse, so not a diseases," which is completely unintelligible. It really, if you listen to the video, then it says zoonotic diseases, period, zoonotic diseases. So there's a start of a new sentence. And so by realizing there's a problem there, not only am I kind of drawn to that for correcting the captions, but as well, if we can begin playing them back that way, the end user might understand that this is not making sense. It's not you. It's the captions. On slide 19, I wanted to talk about some captioning options, and this kind of goes back to some questions from earlier. So we have the ability to upload to YouTube, IBM Cloud Video to do auto generation, but there are ways to improve captions beyond just depending on those effectively free tools. One is to use applications on your own system. So I have an article on using Dragon Naturally Speaking and Camtasia. Dragon Naturally Speaking has a form of speech recognition where you can tell it to auto-punctuate, and it's pretty good about putting periods and commas in the right places. So suddenly it's putting periods and commas, it's capitalized the start of sentences. So if you want to save a bit of time and you're working with video quite a bit, if you've got Dragon Naturally Speaking, you can run your audio through there. You don't have to speak into it. You can record your audio and play it back in Dragon Naturally Speaking, and it'll go through and do, I think, a better job on the recognition, and it'll add in the punctuation and capitalization and starts of words. Camtasia has a similar feature. The second thing is using a transcript or VTT files. I mentioned this with the idea of if you're scripting your narrative, you can upload it. You can also use VTT file, which is just a text file that's intended for actually doing captioning, and you can take it from one application to another. For instance, I find that YouTube has better recognition than IBM Cloud Video, so if I've got something that is not IBM Confidential, I will quite often throw it up on YouTube, grab the VTT file off of that, and then import it into Cloud Video, and then all the timing and everything is done for me. Someone mentioned what captioning services are available. Caption First is the official one that IBM uses right now. There's also more of a web-based feature out there called 3Play Media. There's lots of other ones, but those are two that I think are worthwhile investigating. And finally, playback options. It's really important to consider how your videos play back. As an example, avoid embedded players. They often lack closed caption buttons. You can't even turn on the captions. They tend to have more keyboard issues, so they're not as usable for somebody who isn't using a mouse, and they're really technology dependent. So you can actually have something like IBM Connections, where the video player might work okay in the wiki and it won't work okay in a blog, for instance. And finally, if you are going to do some kind of embedding, make sure you include a separate link that goes to the full player version of it. Now, looking at my time, we've only got about 3 minutes left. On slide 20, I want to talk a bit about promotional or complex videos, but my suspicion is that a whole lot less of us on this call that are dealing with those kind of things. I've got an article that actually talks specifically about this, so I'm going to skip by slide 20 and slide 21, which was a demonstration of a multi-track video player. On slide 21, I think it was Phil asked a question earlier about, is there somewhere that gives good examples of audio playing features, captioning. There's a link on this page, and the link is, again, reproduced in the caption notes, that points to the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. They have a whole thing on captioning and audio descriptions and things like that, and I encourage folks to go out and have a look at that. It's they've got an audio description button you push, and when you do that, it actually not only describes what's happening, but where so much stuff is happening on screen that they can't fit it in real time, it pauses the video to continue the audio description until it's completed, and the video just automatically keeps on flowing. It's pretty nice. So just as a summary on slide 22, I hope I've established that captions and audio descriptions are really increase the value of anybody's videos for everyone. Set up for success, make sure you use a good headset, plan your narration, think about the context you're going to try to give, pretend you're on the radio, make sure you review your captions for accuracy, and ensure you check the playback functionality, make sure that all this work you've done is actually going to be able to get used by the end user. And finally, on the last slide, slide 23, I've got references to an IBM Accessibility, our IBM Accessibility Checklist, a whole series of blogs I've written on accessible videos which cover everything we talked about here in more detail. And then finally, the third bullet on this one is the steps to automatic speech recognition captioning for both IBM Cloud Video and YouTube. And I've gone right out, so there's not a whole lot of time for captions, Neha.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mike. I have a few questions that I think we can take up. There was one question on guidance on optimal length for accessibility videos. Is there an optimal length?
I don't think so. There's pretty interesting statistics going on right now on what kind of video length is mainly consumed, because people are streaming more and more, feature-length films. But I mean, personally, I would rather have a shorter video that has the information I need than a longer video. So.
That's true. Okay, so there was one question about, is there a target grade level to consider when scripting closed captioning demonstration videos?
That's a really interesting question. There's no requirement, but generally speaking, people recommend aiming for junior high school level. So grade, in my culture, that's grade 9, grade 10.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. All right, so I don't see any more questions coming up. I think we've covered all of them that came up, and I'm glad that we could do that. Thank you so much, Mike. Anything you want to add before closing?
People can feel free to contact me on email if they've got any questions they want to follow up on. And a lot of this information was also based off work that Diane Margaritos did, so I want to acknowledge her on that.
Sure.
Okay, and thank you for the team.
Thank you, Mike, for the session. I hope the participants will go from the session with many more important nuggets of information that you shared. And the videos that you shared, they definitely made their point. So thank you so much for that. And thank you, everyone, for participating in today's session. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today.